Okay, let me make you the host, Aaron. Sorry. Okay, I think you are, Aaron, co-host and sharing your screen.
Okay, yeah, that looks good to me. This is Garrett. Can you hear me okay, Pete?
Yep, we got you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So Aaron's here. Aaron, do you want to say a couple words and then I'll jump into the slides?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was talking away there and I was not muted, but yeah, I'll just introduce myself really quick and then I'm just going to run the PowerPoint during Garrett's presentation and then I will take over where he leaves off. So I am with Chelan County Natural Resource Department and work with the Stimmilt Partnership in the Stimmilt planning area, which I'll be talking about later on. And yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Garrett.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks, Pete, for salvaging the Zoom link. It shows that even Zoom gets Zoom fatigue sometimes. And I really appreciate all the folks who managed to connect to the meeting. And hopefully, you know, this being recorded, other folks who missed out can catch up on it. And it has been really interesting to be participating in the workshop series all summer. And I'm looking forward to a real in-person meeting next time. But thanks for joining. I'm coming at you live from the Meadow Valley in Winthrop, Washington. I'm up here on a field trip looking at some areas that burned this summer, and it's been really interesting and eye-opening. But today we're focusing on kind of an overview of some of the work that we've done at DNR, looking at landscape evaluations and in the context of fire risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And we're joined by Aaron, who's going to be really giving some great examples of real world implementation under this framework. So we can jump to the next slide, which I think is an outline. So the first part really I'll jump into is an overview of our landscape evaluation process and tools. You'll see a lot of maps and examples about our analysis. But really the whole purpose of this analysis is to provide information to our partners and to really get at landscape scale implementation of projects. And so that's what Aaron's really going to illustrate today. And then we wanted to leave plenty of time for discussion. And we have about 30 minutes, hopefully. And we'll have a couple of topics to get into related to which elements of the planning tools and maps you might find the most resonant, challenges you might have faced in your particular area. And, oh yeah, there's our list of discussion topics. So just to keep kind of in the back of your mind, this will be kind of our goal is to get to these points and have a nice open conversation with folks. So one would be, how do you see this framework benefiting your work? Another would be sharing examples of how you've been using some or all of the components. And then really we're interested in how can or where can the framework be used to increase the pace and scale of forest health work across the region, both spatially and in collaborative settings. And we're also interested in knowing like what are some of the barriers that could limit the use of this framework. And so we'll give you a lot of material for that discussion, and we're going to keep the discussion kind of a full group, I think, and facilitate that with the chat or with people asking questions if they would like on camera. And Pete will help us out with that part too. So I'll kind of jump into the DNR landscape evaluation piece here. And really, this is a big team effort. Just within DNR, which is a large organization, we have a forest resiliency division. And within that division, we have our planning, science, and monitoring team. And so we have a number of folks really on the more the science and analysis side of things, including the folks on the left of your screen. And then one of the neat parts of working here is we also have environmental planners and folks working on the implementation side. And Amy helped set this up, and actually she couldn't join us today, but many of you may have worked with Amy, and Andrew, Chuck, and Jen, because they're really out there at the interface. And then this DNR program is really part of other efforts within DNR and also outside of DNR. But some of the key elements within our agency are the Federal Lands Program, which includes Good Neighbor Authority, the forest health aerial survey work, community landowner assistance, which is really more like an extension program, stewardship forestry, prescribed fire, and urban and community forestry. So these are all different programs that are part of DNR, and our work attempts to get at sort of an all lands collaborative approach. And the work we're doing today, when we talk about landscape evaluations, is really grown out of this 20-year forest health strategic plan. And I've been at DNR for about 2 years now, and I think we're about 3 years into a 20-year plan. So it's a long-term effort to really focus on restoration of landscape resilience. And it comes in the wake of large wildfires in 2014-15 that really altered the landscape in Washington, both physically, but also psychologically, and really spurred action from legislature to initiate some long-term efforts to try to adapt to increasing fire activity and climate change. And so another piece that's connected is this fire protection 10-year strategic plan. Next slide. And I think it's important we kind of touch base on what do we mean when we say forest health. So our official definition, state statute, is that forest health is in the condition of a forest being sound in ecological function, sustainable, resilient, resistant to insects, diseases, fire, and other disturbances, and probably most importantly, having the capacity to meet landowner objectives. So forest health in some ways really depends on what the objective of that land is. And so our goal is to be able to provide tools for various landowners with different objectives. Slide. And the primary goals of the 20-year plan are to conduct scientifically sound restoration treatments in high priority watersheds, reduce the risk of uncharacteristic wildfire, enhance economic development, plan and implement treatments. And that's really what we'll be focusing on today, is that implementation. And then an important piece is also to develop these monitoring protocols to understand kind of the short and long-term outcomes. And all of these goals really are to increase the pace and scale of restoration. And just by way of a spatial reference here, this is a map of Eastern Washington. So in the left part of the map is sort of the crest of the Cascades. And what we have highlighted in different shades of green and blue here are the priority planning areas that we call. And this map is something that's updated online, and there's a link there for kind of the latest version. But in total, we've got 4.4 million acres analyzed so far that are part of our current efforts. And if you hit the next button, Aaron, just to give you a location of where we are, the Meadow Valley is up in the north central part of the state, and is actually adjacent to two other planning areas, Twist River and Chiluk. And so the goal here is actually these landscapes are identified through a pretty interesting and quantitative process of where in the state are the highest priorities for fire risk and climate adaptation, and also social engagement, and sort of what are the social needs particularly high. And so you can see it's not the entire Eastern Washington landscape, but we are now covering a pretty large area. All right, next slide. And when we get into landscape evaluations, really this is the scientific foundation of the plan, and it's an all lands approach. And our role really is to coordinate among landowners. And one of the primary outcomes of this analysis is to estimate treatment need and prioritize locations for treatments. And really, we aren't managing the land directly. We're providing recommendations, and the landowners are conducting their own planning and implementation. Getting a little bit of buggy connection here, so I'm going to go off camera, but I'll keep talking here. And elements that go into establishing the treatment need and location for forest health treatments are what we call the HRV departure, which is historic range of variation, departure assessment, and fire risk. And then the next layer we bring in is climate change vulnerability, drought vulnerability, and also important habitat needs across the landscape. We don't want to treat everywhere in the forest the same. We want to leave really a much more diverse landscape than is there today. And then the final elements we bring in are the economic and operational feasibility, as well as aquatic considerations. So these are kind of all the key components that feed into this analysis of treatment need and locations. And I'll illustrate a couple examples here with some maps. And today I wanted to focus on examples from the Meadow Valley because that's where we're sitting. Well, that's where I'm sitting anyway. And sort of as shown here, it's north central Washington. And for all of the priority planning areas, we've produced these full analysis set of maps, but also the summary document. And the summaries as well as the GIS data are available online. And so when you see this shape, this map, the Meadow Valley, that's going to be how we illustrate some of the components that go into this analysis here. And when we think about departure, this is really kind of the core of thinking about what was the landscape like before the era of widespread fire suppression and exclusion. What is the landscape like today? And so one way to think about that is through these historical panoramic photos. And this is a really good example from the Central Cascades near Wenatchee, Washington. And you can see that in the 1930s, that particular landscape had some forest, but it also had quite a lot of open areas. So forest density overall was much lower, and the spatial pattern of trees was very different. And that was driven in part by wildfire dynamics, as well as natural disturbances of other kinds, as well as Native American burning. But through the 20th century, landscapes have really changed. So this example of the same landscape in 2010 shows a much higher density of trees. It also shows some areas where bark beetles are beginning to influence some of the trees that have kind of established in that area that didn't used to have forest. So overall, we recognize these are really dynamic landscapes, and the forests of today in general have more trees and more high density forest than used to be there. And so the goal is to think about what kind of treatments and what kind of spatial patterns could bring today's forests closer in line with what was there historically and what might be more viable into the future that's hotter and drier. And when we're presenting one planning area, we go into much more detail about the analysis, and we have different approaches for that departure. But in the end, since we're going to just do an overview today and really focus on implementation, I'm just jumping to kind of the summary table that comes out of this analysis. So in this case for Meadow Valley, it's a pretty big area. The total area is over 300,000 acres. And 180,000 acres of this landscape is forested. And based on the departure and current condition, our analysis suggests that between 49,000 and 75,000 acres of this landscape are suitable or should be treated. But not all treatments are the same. And so we kind of break it down by forest type as well as forest structure condition. So in this case, we have approximately 30,000 acres to 47,000 acres of dry, dense forests and medium large size classes that are our treatment target. A much smaller amount of the moist and cold forest, or 1,500 to 3,000 acres. And then some forest that's currently open, so it's a different type of treatment, but really it would be more of a maintenance treatment to make sure that those landscapes continue to remain open and provide that landscape condition and habitat. And then if you just advance it one more, the other thing we do is break down the current landscape acreage by landowner. And so Forest Service, in this case, USFS, has the largest amount of the landscape. And so a fair amount of the treatment need and targets would be on Forest Service ground, but it's not just Forest Service. There's also a fair amount of private land, Department of Natural Resources land, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and other land owners. And all in all, we estimate the treatment need to be 27 to 41% forested acres within the planning area. So 27 to 40%, it's a significant amount of area. In general, our landscape evaluations fall within that range, sometimes a bit higher, up to 50% even. But we recognize this includes areas that are maintenance of past treatments. And then one other way to visualize sort of the before and after treatment is with these plots. And so here we have the circle corresponding to the current condition on the landscape. So in the dry forest, which is a much larger proportion of this particular planting area, over half of it is medium, large, dense forest. And then, less than half is actually currently open, and that open forest condition is split pretty evenly between small and medium, large trees. And the goal, if these treatment targets are met, the post-treatment condition would look something more like this. So we'd be transitioning some of that medium, large, dense forest into more of a medium, large, open forest. And that's kind of what's happening from left to right in this figure. And then in the lower part of the graph here, in the moist cold forest types, there'd be a relatively smaller change. There would be a bit less of the medium, large, dense forest. But overall, most of the treatment need and focus is on that dry forest condition. And we can skip to the next. So another key piece I mentioned is drought vulnerability, and this is really related to climate change and thinking about how these landscapes are getting warmer and drier and may not support the same type or density of forest into the future. And one of the primary tools we use to get at drought vulnerability is moisture deficit, also known as climatic water deficit. And we think of this as the amount of drought stress due to the lack of water when solar radiation is high, or to get into the technical details, it's potential evapotranspiration minus actual evapotranspiration. And the next slide shows an example of how we calculate this. And so we overlay the current basal area, or the amount of trees in the landscape, the current moisture deficit, and the future moisture deficit, and then combine these into the map on the right, which is our overall drought vulnerability map. And so this is a pretty big landscape, but the areas in the southern part, you can see are highlighting, much more red. These are drier parts of the landscape already, and they're projected to become even drier. And so they are quite vulnerable to drought. Whereas, say, the very far north of the planting area that shows up blue, this would be a place where there's overall the future moisture deficit remains low, and the relatively low current deficit. So that part of the landscape would be less vulnerable to drought. Okay, so that's kind of a quick crash course in some of the elements that go into our landscape evaluations and the type of results that we then come up with these treatment targets. And how are we doing? Oh yeah, so then we roll this together to come up with sort of where in the landscape might be the highest priority to go. And so we combine several other layers here, shown on the left. And I realize I didn't go through each of these components and unpack them, but forest fire risk is relatively intuitive. In this part of the world, a lot of the forest landscape has relatively high fire risk. Then there's the drought vulnerability map we just looked at. Then green on the lower left are places that are currently overabundant forest structure, or the current structure is departed from historical conditions, and you can see it's most of the landscape. And then the last element we bring in here is wildfire transmission to homes, and this gets more at the vulnerability of human communities, and if a fire starts in a certain place in the landscape, how likely is that fire to then threaten places where people are living. So we combine these four maps to get our landscape treatment priority map. And you can see how some of these layers interact such that, in the lower left part of the landscape, that bright red area, it's close to the town of Twisp, it's a place where there's high wildfire transmission to home and high drought vulnerability and high fire risk. And we point out, this really is information. We're not telling people where they need to go. This is information that different landowners can then use to help decide how to develop and implement projects. And then this slide, there's a lot going on here, but the point is to illustrate that here, all the work that we do, within the framework of our 20-year strategic plan is only one piece of the puzzle. So along this long circuitous path, we set the forest health treatment target reflected by that bullseye graphic. We do some additional analyses to look at wildfire response and landscape treatment priority. And then really that's where our initial work ends and the community engagement really takes over. So the goal here is to really work with stakeholders, partners, and get into the local planning and implementation to actualize these recommendations. And so the graphic there with the alignment of landowner objectives and local priorities and local level planning is a really critical piece that involves meetings and clear communication and facilitation. And then finally down towards the bottom, we have sort of treatments occurring and maintaining those treatments and really learning from those treatments in an adaptive management framework. And sometimes when some of our colleagues graphic with a picture of Rambo saying it's never over, didn't include that one today, but you can imagine that this is really an ongoing process, and it's really an iterative process as we learn. So one other piece that I just showed on that last slide here is we refer to as dual benefit. And so just a couple more slides of maps, and then I think we'll pause and pass the torch over to Aaron. But this is a relatively new piece. So the landscape treatment work that we just reviewed has been part of the program for a couple of years. And then just last year, one of our new fire scientists, Anna Barros, developed this dual benefit program. And so this is integrating both the forest health, landscape restoration goals that we talked about already with something more directly related to wildfire response. And so this could be a whole seminar of its own, but there's this framework called pods, which are potential operational delineations for wildfire. And it's a way to zone the landscape into larger units, and the areas within those polygons are called pods, and the boundaries of those polygons are called potential control lines, or PCLs. And so the pods provide a way to understand landscape treatment priority and other components kind of within pods and at that pod scale. And so the map on the right is an example of that landscape treatment priority map I showed before, but now it's just classified into a first, second, and third priority bins, and the whole pod is colored either red, yellow, or blue. So it's a broader way to look at landscape priority that gets at, in this case, forest health goals. And then if you advance the slide one more, there's another pathway where we really focus on the boundaries around the pods, and these are called potential control lines, and prioritizing which of those potential control lines have the highest priority in terms of helping firefighters make strategic decisions to either contain fires or where to allow wildfires to burn under appropriate conditions. So by combining the top and the bottom half of this graphic, we wind up with areas that are ranked by landscape treatment priority geared towards forest health, and potential control lines that are ranked in terms of wildfire objectives. So it's a combination map. And then I think the last piece here is, you might see that map on the left and think, well, if it's blue, it means that we don't need to worry about it anymore. And this just illustrates that if you zoom in within that blue pod and you look at the actual variability in landscape treatment priority, there is still quite a lot of variation, and there are places there that have a high priority, even though they're within a relatively blue pod. So if you happen to be a landowner or land manager in that location, there's still plenty of potential work that could be done under this framework. This slide is really here as a resource, pointing out that all of our data and analyses are available online. And so we have the summary of the evaluations as well as GIS data and documentation. So this is something you can come back to later. And then, yeah, just another link to that overall website where we provide the data and landscape evaluations. So I guess I'll pause here and I'll check in with Aaron because we're at, we've been half an hour going. I have just a couple of notes about sort of this work of wildfire program and how do we make sense of the large fires that are occurring this year. And that's what's brought me up to Winthrop today. We could jump into this, Aaron, after you want to talk about implementation, or I could do a quick look at the maps now. What do you think?
Let's go ahead and continue with the presentation since what you just talked about segues so well into what I'm planning on talking about. And then we can do a time check at the end and see what the questions are. I imagine there might be some questions related to how wildfire affects these landscape evaluation efforts. And so maybe we could come back to it at that point. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Okay. And my computer seems to have settled down. So what we call WOW-RAP, it's kind of a silly acronym, but really we've been thinking about this for a while. When we have these landscape evaluations and treatment goals and all these programs that are being implemented, it takes time. And in some cases, wildfires will occur, before the treatments have been implemented, or even before our analysis is complete. And 2021 really brought that into focus because we've had several large fires right in the middle of these planning areas. So we're really developing this as a pilot program, and there are 4 kind of related objectives. One is to evaluate the effects of wildfires and how they change our landscape evaluation goals. 2 is to summarize and evaluate the relationship between wildfires and past treatments. This is could be a really big research topic, but it's also very timely in terms of how areas that have already been treated are influencing both fire effects and fire spread, as well as fire management decisions. And that 3rd point here is really evaluating how fire managers utilize treatments to establish control lines during wildfires. And then we will be synthesizing lessons from each fire season and really working with our partners to figure out which of these pieces are already being accomplished, which part is new and something that DNR can contribute. And so just a couple of slides here with maps, kind of setting this in context. And just a really basic map here. This is now just the aerial photo of the same Meadow Valley planning area. And I'm kind of sitting in the upper central portion of that right now. And you can see it's a pretty dry, area. There's in the middle, it's mostly open, non-forested area, more agriculture and kind of shrub steppe. But there is, mountainous terrain and forests all around. And so the next slide just shows kind of the fire context. And it's not the prettiest version. In fact, some colleagues we were meeting with here are developing a really cool story map that shows the fire history in this area. And I'm sure that's something that Pete will be able to share at some point. But this just shows all the different fires that have occurred within and around this landscape. And really, north central Washington has had the most fire of any of the parts in eastern Washington. Advance one more, you'll see this year's edition, which, there you go. And so, yet again, 2 large fires. The red one on the left is called the Cedar Creek Fire, and the one to the north is the Cub Creek Fire. And then these are just some, just briefly, you can just see how these are filling in almost like puzzle pieces on the landscape. And so this planning area, a huge chunk of the forest has burned within the last 20 years, or even within the last 15. So it does really influence our analysis and sort of what our objectives are. All right, so the next slide just shows a couple maps. Looking at the left at fire severity, and on the right, I believe, fire progression. Just taking information that's put out, produced by the Forest Service, a severity map called Ravage. And in red is high severity, in blue is low severity, green and yellow are in between. And so, there are a couple of striking large high severity patches within these fires, but there's also a lot of moderate and low severity fire. And so our goal is really to understand, how does fire of different severity really influence forest structure, and how does that change our treatment needs? And you can skip to the next slide, which just shows an example of past treatments, at least conducted by Forest Service in parts of the landscape here. And so, the treatments is a broad umbrella, including commercial and non-commercial harvest, as well as prescribed burning. And so there's a large database of treatment tracking that we've helped develop. But these treatments provide an opportunity to understand both how did the treatments themselves influence fire outcomes, but also how did fire managers interact with those treatments, and in turn influence the fire outcomes. And I think I'll leave it there. I took a bunch of pictures in the field today, but I'm really excited to see what Aaron's got going on the implementation side of things. And if we want to talk more about 2021 fires at the end, I'd be happy to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, this is a super fascinating topic, and I think we'll start to see really how our efforts at implementation are meshing with natural wildfire, across the landscape. So I look forward to hearing more about that in the future. So for now, I'm going to talk about how we've used the landscape evaluation tools to move towards implementation across the landscape in the STMILT planning area. So this is us circled in orange here. The STMILT planning area is kind of on the far eastern slope of the Cascades, just south of the city of Wenatchee. It's mid to high elevation, dry forested landscape. It was a 2018 planning area, and the STMILT partnership is the collaborative group that really helps to guide management in this forested landscape. The STMILT partnership was formed in 2007 in response to the proposed sale of some DNR parcels into private ownership, and the local residents and groups, interest groups really coalesced to help prevent that. They wanted to see the forest stay in public ownership, and Chelan County Natural Resource Department facilitated that formation of the partnership and has facilitated the meetings ever since. So we're we work in close partnership with them. It's a group of stakeholders, a diverse group of stakeholders, from agricultural folks, wildlife biologists, recreation and conservation interests, land management agencies, and landowners. There are several pretty large scale private landowners within the landscape. And the main focus of the partnership, kind of the foundational values, were protecting water resources, wildlife, and recreation. But then since then, forest management has really emerged as a really important aspect of management and conservation of the landscape. So that's a huge, that's, I guess, maybe a fourth pillar at this point. And I'll also mention that in around 2012, a large area of what was then Longview fiberland was coming up for sale. So within, just right kind of in the central area of the basin, so Chelan County was able to raise some community forest grant funding to purchase that property and keep keep it in the public ownership as a community forest. So it's now a community forest of about 15,000 acres of patchwork ownership across the landscape. This is a kind of a zoom in of the higher elevation forested portion of the watershed. So it's two kind of sub watersheds that make up the bigger Squilchuck watershed. And you can see I just wanted to highlight the different ownerships across the area. So we have a large portion of state land, DNR and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then Chelan County. There's some Forest Service ownership on the western side of the basin. There's a state park, Squilchuck State Park. There's the Mission Ridge ski area, which some of you may know, be familiar with that area. But so the planning area basically kind of surrounds the ski area. And that is, it's permitted on Forest Service and WDFW land, but the owners of the ski area also own a significant chunk of private land within the basin as well. So you can see it's really, there's hardly any contiguous sections of ownership. So there's really a need to work, across ownerships in this basin. So we completed a landscape evaluation for the planning area over spanning 2018 and 2019. And this was a little bit of a different approach in that we actually worked with a contractor, Washington Conservation Science Institute, to complete the landscape evaluation because DNR was busy doing other landscape evaluations for other planning areas, and we had the ability to contract and work through it. We used the DNR framework, and we followed the same indicators as Garrett just described, including the vegetation patterns and the departure from what the historical patterns were, insect and disease vulnerability, fire movement across the landscape, fire risk, and focal wildlife species habitats, to work through the landscape evaluation and identify those priority treatment areas. So I have the same kind of synopsis that Garrett showed for the Meadow. This is the Stamil planning area. It's with a target treatment of I think it was 28 to 32% of the landscape in this area. We're looking at a total acres that need to be treated to really shift forest structure into a more resilient condition of around 9,000 to 13,000 acres of total treatment needed. You can see the breakdown of different forest types here is there's a lot of dry forest, both dense and open forest, and then a pretty good amount of moist cold forest as well, because the drainage, the watershed is north facing. So we've got some pretty high elevation north facing forest in there. And you can see the different color coding of those forest types. The blue indicates that that's dense forest that's going to require some more significant treatment, like commercial thinning and more intensive fuels treatment to really shift the structure, whereas the kind of reddish pink coloring is the dry open forest, and that can be treated with more of a maintenance style approach, prescribed fire or less intensive like PCT mechanical fuels treatment. So our landscape evaluation approach, we had a stakeholder group that we worked with throughout the entire process to develop this landscape evaluation. I've listed here kind of a smattering of the different stakeholders that were involved in that process, including the agencies, the Mission Ridge folks, Forest Ridge Wildfire Coalition. Forest Ridge is a development kind of in one of the higher priority treatment areas state parks, Cascadia Conservation District. They were a big part of developing the Squilchuck Community Wildfire Protection Plan a few years prior to our effort. So they had already done, a fair bit of work in the area, and were super helpful to have involved in our process, just to kind of inform what some of the work that had already been done was. We had wildlife biologists and forestry consultants involved, the Stamil Partnership Steering Committee, some of the wildlife interest groups. Chelan County Fire District 1 was involved. So really one of the best parts about developing this landscape evaluation was really establishing these great partnerships and open lines of communication between all of these different stakeholders in the basin, so that we could really communicate about treatments and expand footprints across ownerships, and work together to help each other out, and create some efficiencies in different treatment types. So it was really key part of moving the landscape evaluation to implementation was really just developing these partnerships throughout this planning process. Here's a few photos of field visits during the landscape evaluation process. We had, multiple days out in the field with stakeholder groups, and then lots of indoor meetings too. This was pre-COVID, so we could actually meet together. So some of the kind of overall goals of the landscape evaluation, we took a look at the different forest types, and really wanted to make sure that we're applying, the appropriate treatments to the appropriate forest types, and recognizing that creating and maintaining open canopy forests with large resilient trees was going to be a goal and a focus on those, drier open sites, even some of the drier dense sites. We want the drought resistant and fire resistant trees to be the predominant feature. But also recognizing that there's a place and a need for dense closed canopy forest on the landscape as well, for habitat, wildlife habitat cover, and also just recognizing that some of those denser north facing and riparian and moister forest types, that's their natural condition. And, it's normal to have that spatial diversity across the landscape, and we don't want it to necessarily try to apply the same treatment across the whole landscape, but just recognize that it's okay to have patches of denser forest remaining. That serves a purpose too. And if we can create enough of a landscape scale effect with other treatments, then you're in essence helping to increase the resilience of those denser areas too. We don't want to have a landscape that looks like a perfectly spaced parkland, across the whole landscape. We want to make sure that we still are working with having, clumps and openings and basically be returning it to more of that reference historic condition, and not making it this kind of mechanical looking forest. So this is kind of another way to look at that summary, the landscape evaluation summary. This kind of reiterates the number of acres that need to be treated to really make the land, a positive change across the landscape, and kind of breaks down those two different treatment types: the change in forest structure that might be more of the commercial, the overstory harvest versus just the maintenance treatments. But also this pie chart on the right is showing the land ownership, and it really highlights that private property is a pretty significant portion, looks like about 50% on this landscape of those acres that we want to target treating. So working with private landowners is a huge, a huge component of creating this more resilient landscape, and finding ways to work with private landowners that work for them, that makes sense to them to want to go forward with these treatments. And then we've got about 25% state ownership, and the rest being county and Forest Service. So here, I'm just going to go over a couple of the products that came out of the landscape evaluation, very similar to what Garrett showed in his presentation. I'm not going to go through all the different parameters that were analyzed and modeled, but just kind of wanted to touch on a couple of them. This is the anticipated effects of climate change and the potential increase in drought stress and insect vulnerability due to climate change. And so you can see how this kind of extreme moisture deficit creeps up into the higher elevations over the next, this is 30 to 50 years in the future. The one on the right is the, I think, maybe it's 40 years. Anyway, we're looking into the future and seeing these potential changes in forest structure and drought stress, especially in the central portion of the planning area. And you can also see a significant shrinking of that cold, moist forest as the drought or as the moisture levels decrease into the future. This is the elk model that was developed as part of the focal wildlife species component of the landscape evaluation. So there is a herd of Rocky Mountain elk that resides in the basin, and is elk habitat is a highly valued component of keeping this landscape intact and managing for that habitat. So it was really important to the stakeholders to really develop a good understanding of what elk habitat is, the quality of the habitat that's existing on the landscape. And that was developed through a variety of parameters, but I think the most heavily weighted parameter was late summer forage, because that's such a critical component of elk survival and breeding and producing, offspring in the next spring. So this just shows what came out of that in terms of the darker green being higher quality habitat, and this can really help guide certain aspects of forest health treatments in the sense of where can we apply some forest health treatments that can improve the existing habitat. For example, if there's an area that shows up as not that high of quality, can it be, can the forest structure be shifted to encourage the growth of the shrub species that are, the highest quality forage for elk? Or conversely, if there's an area that shows up as really, really good quality habitat, maybe that's an area that we might want to look at not treating so we don't change that, affect that habitat quality. And here's kind of the conglomerate of the treatment priority maps, just kind of overall treatment priorities. So you can really see that central portion of the planning area really jumps out as being the high priority area to focus treatments on. Like Garrett pointed out, there are areas that may show up, as you zoom in on a finer scale, you can definitely tease out areas that are high priority. But when you take a kind of step back, high level look, when we're thinking about where to focus our treatment efforts, this central band where we may see those potential effects of climate change in the future and really need to start focusing on shifting forest structure to a more resilient condition now, it pops out in this central elevation band, basically. The arrow points to that little green polygon that is the forest ridge development. And I just wanted to point that out as a reference. So when I jump into other maps, you can see how it all fits in and where we've started to look at implementing. You can also see that the development sits right in a really high priority treatment area for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is the risk of wildfire. So I'll just jump right into implementation and how we've used, how those landscape evaluation tools to decide where to focus, and how we've worked with our partners and other stakeholders to start really making an imprint, a contiguous swath of planned or completed treatments across the landscape. So again, I have the same arrow pointing at the Forest Ridge development, so you can see how we've kind of really been able to hone in on this area and in on that high priority swath. Gotta fly. So these colored polygons are all units that have been identified, laid out, and are either complete or will be complete by the end of next year. And these are all units that all stakeholders have contributed to. They're not all units that the county has planned or completed, but being able to work with our partners through that landscape evaluation has it helped everybody understand like how we can all focus these treatments to make this contiguous treatment area and kind of shift across the landscape. So I put together this table. This is basically just kind of a data compilation of what that map shows. And so I've broken it down into the units, the acres, type of treatment per unit, the ownership of the unit, the funding source and the funding amount, and then like the status of the unit. So if you look at the bottom here, you can see that and this was just as of last year. I need to update these maps and tables because we have even more units planned and laid out on the ground since then. But at this point, we're looking at about 2,500 acres that's been completed or will be by the end of next year. And when you think about what our total target acres of treatment were in the landscape, which is about 9,000 to 13,000, we're looking at being really close to about a quarter of the way there. And that's just been in the last 3 or 4 years. So really, if we can continue at this pace and scale, or even increase the pace and scale, we're looking at potentially achieving our target acreage of treatment within the next 10 years or so. And there's still a lot more to do within that high priority treatment area, but we're already making a dent within that area. And we heard it already, the work isn't done. Then if we do achieve those target acres, we're not done. There's a kind of a continual rotation of maintenance and analysis to make sure that those treatment areas are achieving the goals. But that's still very exciting in that it's almost it's an attainable goal in this landscape, and we're making really good progress towards it. I just want to say a quick note about the funding sources. This all started with a Forest Service grant that we were able to do some initial treatments on the landscape, but also do complete some forest management planning and then complete the landscape evaluation with that stakeholder engagement. And that really was what unlocked the DNR competitive grants, because we had these priority treatment areas identified. We could work off of that to ensure that these would be effective treatments. We were able to complete a roads analysis with a DNR Building Forest Partnerships funding, so that we can start to target some of these potential sediment delivery or just aquatic and road interaction issues. We have lots more acreage laid out and have prescriptions prepared and have, we're kind of on this continued cycle of identification, layout, and prescription and implementation now based on the landscape evaluation results. We've also been able to get some Fema funding for hazardous fuels reduction. And I just wanted to point out here another benefit or great use of the landscape evaluation tool is being able to hone in or to kind of tailor specific benefits of a treatment area to specific funding sources. So for example, areas that showed up as really high risk areas through that parameter of the landscape evaluation, we can then go after the FEMA type of funding, which is really designed to reduce risk to communities. Or for using the elk habitat model, if we see a unit, that has potential to really benefit or improve elk habitat, we can go to funding sources like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, who does fund forest management and restoration. So that's another great way to use it, is to kind of look through different filters and be able to apply different funding sources based on those filters. I want to just run through, I want to make sure that we leave time for questions too, but I want to run through some photos of some of the work that we've, some of the implementation work up there. So this was one of our first units done in 2018. It was a lop and scatter unit, pretty fairly light fuel loading, but there was encroachment against these bigger, more resilient trees. And so this was a lop and scatter treatment to clear out around the drip line of those bigger trees and just reduce some of the competition that was growing in. And then we followed that up with a prescribed burn in 2020, and the result is fantastic. And it just looks like what we want a lot of the landscape to look like up there. And then here's a couple more treatment types. In the upper right-hand corner is a shaded fuel break hand piling treatment. And then that type of treatment would be followed up with pile burning later in the season when there's snow on the ground. So we've done quite a few of these along the Upper Basin Loop Road, which is kind of the main public access recreation, public recreation access primitive road through the basin. We've also been kind of ramping up work with a basically a tracked mulcher. And this is a great tool for us in this landscape. It works really well to clear out the reprod that's, the kind of the stuff smaller stuff that's choking out the larger and healthier trees. And I have a quick little video to show what this work looks like and how effective it can be. And basically, this work can be done quickly and efficiently, and it doesn't leave piles behind that you then have to go back in and burn, and that you may have problems with introducing pine beetle if with all the slash that's left. So this is a great tool. It's also more cost effective for us because it doesn't use hand crews, which can really be an expensive option, especially if you have to pay prevailing wage for your work. So we've been going more and more towards this, and that's also a great tool for post-harvest mastication and cleanup. So this is a unit along the Squilchuck Road that's on private land, and we worked with this private landowner and a forester the forester worked directly with the private landowner on a harvest, and then we worked with the private landowner on a post-harvest treatment. So the model is that the landowner does the harvest, and then they contribute revenue gained from the harvest back into a post-harvest treatment with the masticator, which basically takes out the finer fuels and leaves the larger trees and the end product is a really great long-lasting treatment on private land that's very that is not cost prohibitive to the landowner. Here's a photo from the Beehive Road looking out towards Forest Ridge, so you can kind of see the development tucked in that draw there. And you can see that private land unit that I just showed the photo of on the right-hand side. And the reason that I'm excited about this photo is because we have a lot more treatments planned in this area. And I think over time, used as a photo point, this will be a great visual reference for being able to see the actual changes across the landscape in a high priority treatment area. And this is just a map kind of zoomed in again of that high priority treatment area. So that photo was taken from that red splotch from the road, going through that red splotch in the upper left-hand corner. That's a prescribed burn unit on Forest Service land. And they will actually plan to burn over section line into the county unit that was thinned with the masticator this year. So that increases that footprint of that treatment area. And then just looking out across the landscape at that Forest Ridge area, and you can see just all of the additional units that are planned or implemented right around that area. Just really quick, I think we're getting a little short on time, but I'll just mention some other projects that kind of go hand in hand with this forest health work. We've done some meadow and wetland restoration, recreation planning, which really plays into planning these units and kind of assessing the effects on recreation, but also the forest health work can have a huge benefit on recreation because specifically because of some of the road improvements that happen in conjunction with these treatment units in places where otherwise the road maintenance just doesn't happen because people aren't willing to put the money into it. So there's been some really good access improvements in the basin due to these forest health treatments. I mentioned the road inventory and assessment already. The elk movement study, we have an actual camera trap study going on to kind of ground truth the elk model that was developed through the landscape evaluation to even better inform management decisions and how they may affect elk movement across the landscape. Here's a photo of the Meadow restoration project where we had a road basically running through a wetland meadow that was just getting wider and wider, and people were 4x4ing through it. So we rerouted the road completely around the meadow and reseeded and restored the meadow. This is a map that came out of the road inventory and assessment report, and it shows these colored dots are all identified problems and the severity of those problems. So we were able to take that a step farther this fall and take one of the highest priority roads with the biggest issues and actually kind of rework the road to ensure that the proper drainage was happening and that we weren't getting these issues of water running down the road surface. And that was done in conjunction with a haul route road improvement project. This isn't part of the haul route, but we were able to expand that road work to address these issues that were occurring on that road. So I was going to maybe talk a little bit about the nascent planning area. That's kind of our next project that we're working on, but I think that I need to stop and just see if there's any questions. I'll just mention one difference really quickly with the nascent planning area. There is a lot more Forest Service land. So NEPA isn't something that we've really had to spend a lot of time on in the STMILT planning area, but for the nascent planning area, it will be a big component. So our first step here is to just work with stakeholders in a collaborative setting and come up with a strategy for NEPA and how we want to approach these priority treatment packages, basically. So that's kind of what we're launching into right now, but I'm not gonna talk a whole lot about that because I want to leave some time for questions. So yeah, I think that Pete, we were gonna just see if you could help direct some questions from the chat box.
Yeah, we've got quite a number of really good questions. So I think one of the first ones that either one of you can speak to or answer actually relates to the Forest Service. And can you talk a little bit about, is the Forest Service taking steps to align their Forest Service planning and funding to support the 20-year strategic plan efforts?
I guess I could take a first cut at that. Yeah, we work with the Forest Service a lot, and it really varies in terms of which national forest, which project, who we're actually working with. But in general, I found it to be very collaborative. And for example, in the smaller planning area, not too far from Ellensburg, is the Upper Swak planning area. And that's one where the planning area boundary is exactly the same that the Forest Service is working on for their NEPA process as the Dnr Landscape Evaluation. It's also 97% Forest Service ownership in late successional reserve. So there's a whole bunch of issues with spotted owl habitat and fire risk that converge in that place. But that team working on it has been very engaging and interested in the tools that DNR has developed. And then they've got a number of parts of their process that take some time, but they seem to be making pretty good progress. So that's one I've been working directly with folks on. Another one in southeastern Washington on the Umatilla National Forest, different set of people, but similar shared interests. And actually a lot of the DNR planning areas are Forest Service ownership is really the largest component. So we want to be sure we're providing information, but ultimately it's the Forest Service collaborative process that kind of governs the outcomes. But maybe Aaron has some insights as well from Chelan County Central Cascades.
I think that your insight is probably better than mine in that we haven't, you've had a lot more intersection with the Forest Service, but I think we have seen in the Upper Wenatchee area, the Forest Service here, and that's a DNR 20-year planning area as well. I think the agencies are pretty well aligned in that sense, and that there are, once that gets a little further along into implementation, it does seem like the Forest Service will be able to help dedicate, resources to that planning area.
Yeah, I might add just a little bit to that is, my understanding is the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, many of their priority planning areas, it's not surprising, sort of, they overlay really, seamlessly in many cases with what DNR's work. So, I think, their priority planning areas are well within the priority planning areas of many of DNR's landscapes as well. And then the next question, there was a question about if you could make those, maybe share the link for where the results for those other planning areas, Garrett, you mentioned. If we can make that available so folks can take a look and see what else is available. I think you shared the link in your presentation, but we could share it out afterwards so folks have that information.
Yeah, happy to share the slides, and also I'll dig up a link right now and put it in the chat for folks.
Okay. And then can you speak a little bit? There were some other questions about the landscape evaluation, Garrett, that you might, you have your presentation up, so maybe you could talk a little bit, but maybe spend another minute or two speaking about how the landscape evaluations are updated after a wildfire goes through the area. Yeah,
well, that's really, we're trying to figure that out this trip, right now, and central, northern Washington. But in a simple sense, we're calling it the work of wildfire because the scale of wildfires is usually much larger than the scale of treatments or even prescribed burning. And sometimes we call wildfires kind of a blunt tool. So it's not something that's, you can really control all the outcomes. But in many cases, low severity, moderate severity fires, very similar in terms of changes in stand structure or composition, that some of the treatments and prescriptions would be. And even some cases of high severity fire would be consistent with restoration of some open habitat conditions. So in a simple sense, we're looking at a crosswalk where certain burn severity class combined with the pre-fire condition changes that structure based on our data analysis. And so when the structure changes, that amount of forest acres that is departed from historical conditions is also changed. So we'll be changing that summary table based on the fire effects, but we're really working through it right now. And our goal is by the end of this year to update the Meadow Valley planning area, as well as the Asotin planning area down in the southeastern part of the state.
Are there, Aaron, you had a really good slide that you shared about some of the different funding mechanisms to help pay for some of the treatments at this on the stem mill. Are those, what, you know, and then Garrett, I know DNR has some other funding to help pay for private lands, but could you, either of you speak a little bit to the funding solutions to help address private land treatments that are needed in some of these areas?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. So it is hard to fully fund, to get grant funding to fully fund projects on private lands, because there's the DNR Landowner Assistance Program, who's, you know, the program is a cost share program. And so they come in with, you know, 50%, 75%, whatever it is, to help these private landowners get work done on their grant land. And it's expected that the landowner will have some skin in the game too and be contributing. So that's something we've kind of worked through with the small landowner program, because they, you know, we don't want to, the Natural Resource Department has been able to get grant funding to do work on private lands, but we want to be sensitive to not overstepping, you know, that whole premise of the small landowner program. So the approach that we've used is basically if there's private landowners who have large contiguous ownership of forest land that is adjacent to private or to public lands where there is forest restoration work already occurring, then that's a place where we can step in and say, okay, we're basically expanding the footprint of these treatments on public lands across onto private lands. And that gives us a little bit more leverage to be able to come in with this grant funding and say, we're just going to do it. Plus those bigger landowners, you know, with the cost, it can be cost prohibitive to them to do a treatment that's going to, you know, be $50,000, $100,000. So, so that the way we've approached it is a way to make it possible to get large scale treatments done on private lands without much hardship to the private landowner. How we've kept the skin in the game part of it is often these large private pieces will have an overstory or a commercial harvest component, so that the landowner is expected to contribute the revenue they've generated from the harvest to go back into the land for the post-harvest treatment. Because the overall goal of these treatments is forest restoration. It's not cut it all down and make money. It's thin the forest out, allow those bigger trees to continue to grow, to be large and resilient. So the overall treatment goal is a restoration goal. The private landowner benefits because they get a long-lasting treatment on their property and they don't have to pay out of pocket for it, but they are contributing in the sense that they're putting any revenue that's generated back into the project. And then we can come in with the grant funding match source and basically take care of the rest of the cost. So that's how we've approached that. But we do work closely with the landowner assistance program to make sure that we're not like, you know, stealing their thunder or, you know, like undercutting their program basically. So.
Yeah, there was a note in the chat that the Forest Service retained receipts can be used on private lands, it looks like, as long as there's a benefit to the adjacent national forest lands, like to help prevent invasive species or fish passage or et cetera. And so somebody mentioned that they've seen that used. One question that, Garrett, I think this one's probably for you. If you can speak a little bit to how landscape evaluation, the landscape evaluation framework takes into a consideration species composition. Is there a component to understand and integrate compositional shifts resulting from past harvests or fire exclusions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we do have, one thing we have at DNR are a lot of data layers. And if you explore that link, you'll see access to all the pieces that go into these landscape evaluations. In a broad sense, we often combine forest types into dry, moist, or cold, kind of a broad generalization. But even within that, we have information on the specific cover type or species composition. And so it depends a little bit on which type of analysis we're using. And I didn't go into much detail, but in a lot of the Okanagan Wenatchee forest, we use a photo interpretation method developed by Paul Hesberg and others. And in that case, there are polygons that aerial photo interpreters have estimated the structure and composition of different cover types. In some of the other planning areas like this Meadow Valley, we use a combination of LiDAR and digital aerial photographs to look at forest structure. And then we brought in some other methods to get at species composition. So there's sort of a lot of discussion we could have over the accuracy of those maps and implications. But in this place, for example, a lot of the forest really is a dry forest condition, more of a dry ponderosa pine or mixed conifer forest. And in the mixed conifer type, Douglas fir is often the species that has increased in its abundance and is often kind of targeted for removal, you know, when it's a restoration treatment, leaving large trees and especially large pine in some of the areas I was in today. So the wildfire accomplished some of those objectives for us. In other places, there were large swaths of large ponderosa pine that had been killed, so it was pretty striking. And so maybe I'll leave it there. I know we're short on time, but we certainly try to account for species composition in a couple different ways.
Yeah, yeah, it is 2:30, so I do want to respect folks' time. So if you need to step off, I have a little bit more flexibility and I'm willing to stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes because of the delay. If Aaron and Garrett, you want to answer a few more questions, or if there's, but I do want to give folks, understanding that it was scheduled at 2:30, an opportunity to step off if they need to. But again, we will be making this presentation available online. We'll send out the link so you can see anything you missed along with the survey as well. We'll get that out to you folks hopefully by the end of the week. So, but thanks for coming and participating if you do need to step off. Another question, Garrett, was, or I guess Aaron too. What has been your experience around landowner acceptance of the need to move forested landscapes, both public and private, toward that HRV? How have those interactions gone?
I'll very briefly go, but I'm mostly curious to hear what Erin thinks, because I think she is much more at that interface of different landowners. Kind of on the public land side, it's an interesting question because the general public at the end of the day are the owners, and there are a wide variety of perspectives. But I think the collaborative stakeholder groups have really, it's been established as a model where different people, different perspectives come together and try to find some common ground. And in general, I think there is a common ground around many of the restoration objectives, especially as regarding to fire risk and increasingly in terms of climate change. And so, I'll leave it at that. And I'm curious what Aaron thinks from more of a private land or NGO kind of perspective.
Well, I would say in our planning areas, private landowners have been really quick to jump on board with wanting to do treatments, and the amount of work that our foresters are getting just in our planning area, but also outside of it by people who drive through it and see the work that's going on. I think people that live in this area have been wanting to do something for a long time, and this landscape evaluation and our outreach to the community has really provided that that catalyst to get people to like want to move forward with treatments to shift the landscape. So from my perspective, people are wanting to do it, wanting to get it done. There might be a slight difference in perspective from people who maybe own land here but don't live in this area, or just are coming from different backgrounds and might like the forest the way it is. They're used to kind of this seeing it one way, and they don't. I've heard that sentiment from, for example, from the Mission Ridge. The owner of the private land, kind of in conjunction with the Mission Ridge, was at first a little hesitant, and they're like, well, it's such a beautiful forest. And after, seeing a few treated areas and kind of starting to grasp and understand the scale of the issue, they've come around. So I would say people over here are ready to get work done on private lands as well as public.
Garrett, this probably is a little bit more for you because it relates to the tracking and I think monitoring piece, but how will DNR be tracking progress towards meeting these targets, and what will that look like?
It's a really good question as well. So there are a number of scales or levels to that. We have this overall monitoring program where we're looking at local landscape and regional changes in forest structure composition related to both treatments and especially natural disturbances. We also have this forest health tracker. It's a very cool website, and maybe I can have that something that Pete can send out. So it's a way to track treatments in a standardized, consistent way. And there are a wide variety of treatment types, different landowners, different programs categorize things differently. So this is an effort to really standardize those treatments and put them on the map and provide as much information as we can. And then ultimately, once we've established this sort of baseline goal, that table I showed where it was, 27 to 41% of the landscape over the next several years, as treatments continue to happen, where we reach that implementation phase, we'll update that table and track all the planning areas in kind of a large master table. But I guess the key thing that comes to mind is that it's never complete. There's a large component of this that is maintenance. Historically, these landscapes burned regularly, and so it's not something that can be treated once and walked away or burned once. It's really about thinking about the next fire or the next treatment. And it's a big change in our perspective, but I think it's sort of, especially having spent a couple of days looking at these large fires, fires definitely here, and it's a question of how do we, not only track it, but kind of adapt to this condition.
And then how might treatments change with post high severity wildfire? And is there flexibility in the implementation plan to account for these changes? Thinking of the landscape evaluations were conducted in 2018, and yet we've had, and you actually mentioned it too with the Cub Creek and the other fire up in the Meadow this year. So how are you? I know you, yeah. Yeah,
no, I'd say stay tuned. We're actually trying to figure that out right now, how to do that in a systematic way. Standard placing fire in particular is something that is generally, considered to be undesirable. There is a time and a place depending on the forest type. But in overall, we're figuring out methods to track the changes in structure and composition that have occurred due to fire, and then integrate that into our overall framework. So it literally changes the landscape and the treatment recommendations there. So, I think maybe, yeah, I'll leave it there. We have a couple meetings coming up today and tomorrow to continue to develop that.
Okay. And then what can you, there was a question related to most of this work is focused on, you've presented on today, has been focused on the east side of the mountains. Can you speak to what's occurring on the west side of the Cascades in terms of similar efforts on that side of the mountains?
Well, yes and no. If Andrew Spaeth was here, he could go into detail about the forest action plan and some prioritization work that's going on for the west side. There is certainly interest in west side forests in terms of fire risk, but also in terms of carbon management and restoration. So thinning forests in terms of fire fuels considerations isn't the same dynamic. But we are certainly need to be prepared for wildfire on the west side. It's not really within the framework of the 20-year plan and these landscape evaluations. This program is really focused on the drier forest landscape. But the short answer is that yes, DNR is working on a sort of a statewide and including west side analysis and thinking about priority watersheds on the west side. And I'm happy to follow up with that person and get them in touch with the right people here.
And there was a question that said that this was directed, and I don't totally understand the question. So I'll just read it verbatim, and it's for you, Garrett. It says your priority analysis for drought vulnerability included combining past and future CWD with basal area. I thought modeling CWD already took into account vegetation, including basal area. Is that not true?
Very specific question. I like
that's
it.
Very, yeah, I was gonna say I have Greek.
Yeah. So the way we're estimating CWD or climatic water deficit is really based on climatology. Precipitation and soils is more biophysical. It's not directly related to the composition or structure of the forest in a mapping sense. So what I guess the best way would be to follow up. We have a pretty detailed data dictionary at that link that describes how we compute CWD. And the current basal area piece helps to emphasize kind of what is the overall distribution of high biomass forests or places that are higher water demand. So it is a separate piece from how we're calculating CWD.
Okay. There was one last question about they said doesn't seem like there was any work done of the priority watersheds. None of them appeared to be on either the Yakima, Colville, or Spokane reservation lands. What does that tell us about how maybe that some of our tribal partners are managing their forest and their fire situation, or did DNR not take into account those lands?
Well, we're definitely interested in all lands, and we do have some good active partnerships with various tribal groups. I don't know if Aaron can slide back to that early slide that has the planning areas in Eastern Washington, but some of the planning areas do include tribal land. So for example, the Yakima down in the southwestern portion of that map, the Glenwood, Klickitat planning areas do include some Yakima Nation lands. And I believe the Republic planning area in the central part of the state does overlap some with the definitely with tribal partners, and they are one of the key landowners. And some related research on sort of drought vulnerability and which forests are
You're kind of
pretty highlighted. So that's something we're just working on now, and looking forward to engaging with folks on.
Well, that's about all the time we have today. But thank you, Aaron and Garrett, for coming and presenting. It was a very useful conversation. I will be sending out, or we'll be sending out a link to a survey, along with some other links, and also the presentation to share with folks. But go ahead. But thank you all for participating today. And we will be hopefully meeting in person in April of 2022. Again, there's this webinar and other webinars that have been part of this 2021 virtual session are available on our website, sustainablenorthwest.org, and then search Forest Collaborative Workshop Series. And if you have questions, please feel free to get a hold of Sally Bernstein, my colleague, with her contact information there. But thank you all for participating today. We hope you found this as useful as we did.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Aaron.
It was good to be here.
Thank you, guys. Good presentation.
Yeah, I'd like to get out in the field and go see Stamelt or go up to the Meadow. I'm jealous of you both.
Well, I can show you around the Stamelt.
Yeah.
The larches are just starting, so it's a good time to be up there.
Oh yeah, we should definitely do that.
All right, thanks, Pete. Thanks for salvaging the link.
Yeah,
it seems like we had a good turnout, and it's been a great series overall. Yeah,
we had 64 today come on, so that was good. I don't know what happened with the initial link, but yeah, apologies for that. I said, I was like, wait, and then Aaron called and I was like, I don't know what's happening. But yeah, thank you both for your flexibility. I know it's not the best way to start a presentation when you're like, I can't even get on the thing, but you did, both did awesome. Like, really useful.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, well, you pulled it together, so good work.
All right, well, we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.
All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.